Ken, you do it inside the Beltway. A good Tuesday to you. It is Election Day in New York. I'm looking at the cover of the New York Post this morning. Vote to save New York. Eric Adams is the choice of the New York Post. The Brooklyn Borough president, African-American former cop, has surged to a significant lead over Andrew Young, according to a new poll. He is the first choice of 28% of Democratic voters, followed by Andrew Yang at 20%, former sanitation commissioner 15%, City Hall lawyer Maya Wiley in fourth with 13%. The poll of 2,924 New York City residents conducted June 10 through June 17 also shows Adams beating Yang 56 to 44% in the seventh round of ranked choice voting simulation. Now, ranked choice voting is a nightmare, so I don't know when we'll find out the end of this, but you go through and you drop in the first round everybody the lowest person who did not get enough votes to compete. So then they're down to 6, and they take the seventh person's vote and they redistribute them, then the fifth person's vote and redistribute them. To me, it's a question about whether or not the nutters in the city have distributed themselves. The Bill de Blasio fans, you get like 8% in the polls. Where do those people go? The socialists and consequences be doggone to the world. We're not going to care what the consequences are. But normal, middle of the road, middle class New Yorkers would like not to be shot on their way to work, don't want their cars vandalized, don't want gangsters running around the streets shooting kids, don't want random acts of violence occurring. They're voting for Eric Adams and a return to basically Giuliani Bloomberg-style seriousness about policing. The first rule of a city is to police. The second is to keep the streets clean, the garbage picked up. And Bill de Blasio's nightmare 8 years is almost over. Who are the billionaires' picks, according to the New York Times? Follow the money. Steve Cohen donated $500,000 to Mr. Yang's PAC, and $500,000 to Mr. Adams' PAC. A similar trajectory characterized the giving patterns of Daniel Loeb, another hedge fund billionaire. He donated $500,000 to Mr. Adams' super PAC and $500,000 to Mr. Yang's super PAC. And then Mr. Loeb gave Mr. Adams' super PAC another $500,000. You see, Yang and Adams are perceived as being the least crazy people. And so New York City will tell us a lot about the Democrats, and they know they've gone nuts on critical race theory, on rejecting voter ID. In fact, there's a story in the Washington Post by Aaron Blake yesterday, Stacey Abrams and the Democrats' evolution on voter ID. Because the voting reform bill will come up today, and it's not voting reform, it's state suppression bill. It's an anti-voter integrity bill. And Joe Manchin's compromise actually has voting ID in it, but it also still takes away from the states the ability to run their own elections, so it will fail too. But Stacey Abrams and the Democrats have finally figured out that the country wants voting ID. It really does. Like supermajorities, over 70%, want people to show an ID at the polls before they vote or to get an absentee ballot. They want to make sure that people are people. Easy to vote, hard to cheat. That's won the debate. And so today, I love the coverage in the Washington Post. Activists gear up for battle as Senate Republicans prepare to block voting rights bill. That's like my gearing up to take on LeBron James in a one-on-one game. All right, so yeah, I would gear up, and I would get crushed. I'd gear up to take on Bryson DeChambeau, right? And he could have the worst day ever and throw a tantrum, and I'd still be gearing up for no. You can gear up all you want. There is no battle. There is no Senate voting bill coming out. It's not happening because there are not even close to 60 votes for it. And so Democrats unite behind voting rights bill as it faces a Senate roadblock. Actually, they haven't united. They have to go for, if anything, Manchin's compromise, and Manchin's compromise is still not even close to being constitutional, so it's going to fail. Stocks rebounded yesterday. The Dow gained 500 points. Amazon even fell a little bit, 1%. And it was prime day 1. Today's prime day 2. Why did that happen? They think that inflation will be dealt with by the Fed with 2 quarter-point increases next year, and the price of lumber went down. And so all of a sudden, investors says, let the party begin. We're still getting $2 billion and probably another $2 trillion. We'll probably get another trillion. So let the investing begin. And inflation's going to be here at 4 and 5%. So we're not going to buy treasuries at 1.5% for 10 years. So they're off to the markets. And I expect there will be continued revelry in the markets. We will see. Interesting story in the New York Times. How do they say economic recovery? Quote, I quit. It's happening all over the country. People are quitting their jobs. Why? Because it's a dynamic job market. People need workers everywhere. Dwayne, are you there today? Is Dwayne there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure you hadn't quit.
Not yet.
Not yet. So it's another day.
It's still early.
Still early. Of course it is. We got 3 hours to go. But nevertheless, when you read a headline like that, I'm sure Heckle and Jekyll are there, aren't they? Ben and Harley?
They are here for now.
For now, okay. It would be bad if during the show they were reading this New York Times story and they wandered off down the hallway and said, I'm going to go work for Supercycle or whatever it is. Lumber prices fell, Dwayne. I want you to know that as well. Now, you have finished,
just
right?
in the nick of time.
Just in the, you're all done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted people to know Dwayne
Timing
was actually... Dwayne has actually done everything. Dwayne has done everything he's done, and so the demand for lumber has plummeted because he built the palace. You think Gallagher is done with his remodel? Is that the other thing that's going on? Maybe Mike is done?
On which palace?
Well, he's got 4 of them.
I know. That's what I'm saying. Which one are you talking about?
I thought he was only working on 2 of them. I thought he was working on the Colorado retreat and the New Orleans penthouse. Am I right? Okay, so
something like that, yes.
Yeah, so the lumber is falling down. Now, the bad news is eating disorders surged among adolescents during the pandemic. And when we count the cost of the CDC's many failures, that's going to be number one. The impact on young people at a fragile age. They've done a lot of terrible damage to themselves. Yesterday, and I'm going to spend most of the first hour talking about this. I'm going to talk about it with a lot of our guests today. Student athletes win U.S. Supreme Court showdown against the NC2A. Supreme Court backs payments to student athletes in NCAA case. Supreme Court rejects NCAA's tight limits on athlete benefits compensation. Supreme Court rules against the NCAA restrictions on colleges offering educational perks to compensate student athletes. Okay, the reality is it was a unanimous court upholding an injunction that was rather limited, but it took Justice Kavanaugh 2 pages to say what Justice Gorsuch said in 35. And I'll go over that. Justice Gorsuch had the majority opinion, so we don't know if everyone agrees with Kavanaugh. But Kavanaugh is blistering. Gorsuch is careful and gives us a history of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, no, but everyone just wants it. They want to know, what can we give to the kids to get them to come to school? There's a competitive market out there for athletes. What can we give to the kids? And so the most important person in America right now is named District Judge Claudia Wilken, out in Oakland, because she issued the original injunction, which was upheld by the Ninth Circuit and which was upheld by a unanimous Supreme Court, which, by the way, is a heck of a way to go, Judge Wilken. And people ought to be out there doing the golf clap for Judge Wilken, because you rarely get your injunction when they're very detailed and long to survive a Ninth Circuit review and then to be unanimously. She did a good job, and it's back to her now to explain what the NC2A can do and not do. I hope she guts them. I hate the organization, hate the game, not the players. So the people at the NCAA might be very nice, but the NCAA should be put in the grave. Meanwhile, the U.S. swim team is taking 11 teenagers to Tokyo Olympics. What could go wrong? In Washington, the Israeli Defense Force chief warned against rejoining the Iran deal. Tom Cotton will be along. Raisa, the new crazy right-wing nutter mullah running Iran's, pretend presidency, says ballistic missiles are not negotiable. And the EU has said the crown and poldark may not be shown in Europe. That makes a lot of sense. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm going to tell you a lot about student athletes when the show returns on The Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by David Drucker, the Washington Examiner. You see him on TV as well. Good morning, Drucker. How are you?
I'm great, Hugh. How are you?
Good. I learned yesterday from Punchbowl or Axios that you're one of 17 people coming out with a book about President Trump. What's the title of yours and when does it drop?
I didn't even realize that this was out.
Yeah.
Still working out the title. It's coming out this fall, and I'm trying to look ahead and look forward. And so this isn't a retrospective, although there's context in there, but it's about how I'm hoping that I'm telling the story of how the former president has impacted the party going forward. And,
okay, I'm good with titles. I helped Sarah Huckabee Sanders with her, so I'm going to suggest you to use AT/BT or BT/AT, before Trump, after Trump. That's just my for the moment, but it's coming out in the fall.
Correct.
Okay, when do I get the galleys?
Next month.
All right, good. Just checking. All right, good. You know, you're 17 books, man. You shouldn't be talking to me. You should be writing or editing. You're probably in the copy editing part right now, aren't you?
Yeah, how do you know I'm not writing or editing? Exactly.
You could be. You could be. All right. I want to talk to you about Kristen Sinema's op-ed in the Washington Post this morning. She says, look, we used the filibuster last year and this is great. A Democratic senator saying, hey, we used the filibuster last year on a couple of big issues, and you're crazy not to think you'll be back in the minority, so I support 60 votes. Will that finally end the silly, because the voting rights bill isn't going to pass today. Nothing's going to pass that doesn't get 60 votes, and the 60-vote threshold isn't going away. It's been silly to talk about it.
It is silly to talk about it, but no, it's not going to end the discussion because, in part, the Democratic base believes that, and I really think the base believes this, the Democratic base, that Republicans don't really want to govern. And so if you give up on the filibuster, even when we end up back in the minority, Republicans won't actually do anything with a 51-vote legislative advantage. And therefore, there really is no danger. And I think that is, both sides tend to get the other side wrong on particular things, but a lot of very progressive Democrats don't think Republicans want to govern. And so they don't really think there is much downside to ending up back in the minority because Republicans won't do anything anyway.
What do you mean by want to govern? What do they think that means, David? Does that mean pass laws? Do they think that's governing? But do they think that hiring police is governing? Because that's what Republicans want to do. They want to hire more police because we've got a crime panic in the United States going on.
Look, that will all be debated. But my point is, if you were to tell the progressive base, look, Republicans would pass this law and that law and this law and that law, they'd say, no. I mean, maybe, but maybe not, and probably not, because they don't really want to do much. They just want to stop things. So I think that drives a lot of it. Look, I think the other part of it, and this is just a view coming out of the Trump years in January 6th, is that they feel as though democracy is under threat and you need to do anything and everything you can, because not doing something about voting laws and all of that is a whole lot worse than the risks of ending up in the minority and having Republicans do anything they want. I think the problem with this argument is that they're making an argument on principle that the filibuster is antiquated or worse, and we've heard those arguments, what the worst ones are, and yet they've used them freely.
Yeah, and that's what Sinema says. Just last year.
And I think it's very hard to win an argument with voters when you practice situational politics, and so much of what goes on in Washington, not all, but so much is situational. The two sides sort of trade arguments. When you're in the minority, the argument you make is you should not have a tyranny of the majority. And, of course, the minute you're in the majority, you start complaining about the tyranny of the minority. These are process arguments, and voters look the other way.
The Sinema op-ed says, quote, once in a majority, it is tempting to believe you will stay in the majority, but a Democratic Senate minority used the 60-vote threshold just last year to filibuster a police reform proposal and a COVID relief bill that many Democrats viewed as inadequate. Those filibusters were mounted not as attempts to block progress, but to force continued negotiations towards better solutions. Actually, I think they were mounted to win an election, but that's legitimate in a democracy. If it's to your political advantage, you're going to use it. So the big deal here is a journalistic deal, David. It is not going to change. So is it not corrupt for journalists to continue to writing as though it's going to, and this SB1 isn't going to pass, There isn't going to be voting bill. None of this is going to happen.
Look, I know what you're getting at. I don't think it's corrupt. I just think it's, not the best journalism. I mean, I think it's important to approach the reporting on this with context and with an understanding of what's going on and where things are headed. But as I have said before, and and even I fall prey to this, when you feel like you can make news with something, you press politicians to answer questions that you believe are newsworthy in the moment. But I have never seen this going anywhere, and it's, unless Manchin and Sinema and a couple of other Democrats that don't get a lot of pressure change their mind, nothing is happening.
Dead, and they're not going to. David Drucker, thank you, my friend. I'll be right back. America, hour 2 ahead on the Hugh Hewitt Show. I want to remind you that our sponsor is AndrewandTodd.com. They're with Sierra Pacific. They lend you money to refinance your house or buy a home or help your son or daughter become investors in real estate by becoming a non-occupying co-borrower. They help senior citizens with reverse mortgage. They help veterans with no money down mortgages. They help you refinance. So if you need to get money out of your house or you need a whole new house, go to AndrewandTodd.com or call them at 888-888-1172. Morning glory, America. Bonjour. Hi, Canada. Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway, joined by Byron York. Byron is, of course, with the Washington Examiner. You see him on Fox News as well. Good morning, Byron.
Good morning, Hugh.
Last night I had dinner with a friend who took the Acela down from New York. And I wanted to ask you, have you been back on the Acela yet since vaccination? And I gather masks are still required on the train, but have you taken it yet?
I have not taken it. As a matter of fact, the last time I took it, I think I went up to New York to do Fox News Super Tuesday coverage. So what was that, like March the 3rd? And I remember, if you remember, the CPAC conference had been here in Washington, the Washington area.
Yep.
And they had a case. There was somebody, or maybe more than a couple of people, who had it. And someone who had been at CPAC walked up and introduced himself. We had a nice talk on the train. And everybody was wondering, wow, is it on the train? But tell you the truth, I have not done a lot of traveling by car, but have not been on the train since.
Well, I bring this up because many Beltway journalists have a deep investment in the Acela and in New York City. But we only see a small part of New York City. We see from the 30s to the 90s. That's what I think most journalists see. They think New York is maybe even less than that. It might be from 44th to 70th, right? It's a small part of New York in which journalists live.
You. They all live in Brooklyn. Okay? It's not Manhattan. It's not the 30s to the 90s. They're all living in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is more expensive than the Upper West Side is. I mean, Brooklyn, it's been for years. It's been the place.
I mean the Outlanders, like you and me. We have to go to New York a few times a year, and we are Outlanders. So we land and for us, it's that little square. But we nevertheless have a stake in who runs New York because we like to wander around New York when we're there, and we take the trains and the cabs, et cetera. So the mayoral race today in New York matters to us. Have you, Byron York, ace political reporter, been following it at all?
Just a little bit here. Here's what I think is going on. If you remember back in the last year of the David Dinkins administration, which was 1993, many of your listeners may not remember that, but they can read about it. 1993, there were roughly 2,000 murders in New York.
Yep.
Rudy Giuliani is elected, and after 4 years, or 5 years, there are 600 murders in New York. Now, 600 may sound like a lot, but New York is a huge place, and he had literally cut the murder rate into less than a third of what it had been. And it kept going down through the subsequent years of Giuliani's time and through the 2 terms of Michael Bloomberg. And I think one of the questions for New York in electing Bill de Blasio was, do we continue with that progress that created public safety, or, like the patient who takes his meds, feels better, and decides he doesn't need his meds, can we just stop? And we'll go back to our old ways. So they went back to their old ways, electing de Blasio. So now they have this choice. The murder rate is still way, way, way below what it was when I talked about the end of the Dinkins administration. But crime is going up quite a bit. Public safety is the number one concern. And the question is, what are the voters going to do? Remember, when Giuliani ran for re-election, I believe in 1997, he got reelected, although nobody voted for him. I mean, people they wouldn't come out and say, I'm going to vote for Giuliani, but they did, because they wanted the place to be safer. And it did two things. It created an incredible quality of life, because New York City is the greatest city in the world. It created an incredible quality of life for people who live there and for people who visited there. So New York has had this choice because they're so blue. And, you know, the New York Times actually did a story, was it yesterday, about just sort of the Republican disappearance in heavily blue areas like New York. It has a choice. Does it give in to its progressive wing, or does it try to have a more common sense style of governments like Giuliani and Bloomberg had? So is there a candidate now who is roughly, analogous to either Giuliani or Bloomberg? I wouldn't say so. The whole darn field has moved over to the left, but we have seen at least some interesting things from some of the candidates.
Well, I think Adams is sort of Bloomberg, the party of Bloomberg, and not Giuliani, but the party of Bloomberg. But I contrast my Democratic friends, when they were kids, went to the 1976 Democratic Convention, and Guerin and Poneman got held up at gunpoint during that convention. I went to the 2004 Republican Convention and covered that, and it was a joyous party everywhere in the city. People went all over the city all day long. It was just one great party with the demonstrators in a little cage by Madison Square Garden. And the difference between those two conventions was the difference between pre and post Rudy. And now they're not going to go back to Rudy, but they're not going to do stop and frisk of Bloomberg years, although they might. It's very unnerving. And this leads me to what Joe Biden is doing. He's going to talk about crime, Byron York, this week. Yeah. What do you think that telegraphs?
Extraordinary. Let me say one more thing about the New York candidates. We did have this extraordinary moment a couple of days ago when Andrew Yang talked about homeless people and being harassed, New Yorkers being harassed by mentally ill people. And this has been an argument for generations now, in which liberals basically wanted to deinstitutionalize people who actually needed to be institutionalized. You see, in any big city, you see people living on the street who are drunk, on drugs, or crazy, or both, who are just leading terrible lives. They need to be institutionalized to help them. It is not helping them to have them live under some cardboard on a street corner. And it's also, there have been quite a number of attacks on New Yorkers by, as Yang said, people who were mentally ill. So just to have a candidate come out and say that in the Democratic race, and of course Yang got criticized for it, was really extraordinary. So now, what's interesting about Biden is Democrats, we've had this enormous increase in crime in our nation's big cities, which are all run by Democrats. And on the national level, they haven't talked about crime at all. I mean, Joe Biden just doesn't want to talk about it. So the idea that he's even going to address it, I think, marks a major step forward for them.
It does. President Trump bet on winning re-election on crime, betting that the George Floyd demonstrations, those which spun into riots, would basically bring back 1968 politics. He bet wrong. Nevertheless, in the off years, I do not believe that crime has gone away as an issue, and I expect very much for Republicans to be talking about funding the police and improving the police, not defunding the police and removing law enforcement from the streets. I think that's going to be a number one issue, and I know that from the Republican Study Committee, which I talked to last week. Jim Banks had me talk to that group. I know from the governors when I went there. I know from the senators when I went there. It's a Republican issue, and we back law enforcement, and Democrats don't.
Yeah, I don't think Trump's loss reflects at all on that, on the crime issue, because the loss had so many other factors involved. But the fact is, whenever crime is up, whenever public safety is an issue, it's the most important issue because it's the most fundamental. People are scared physically for their own safety and for their families' safety, and just for the nature of their community as a whole. So
when I say that Trump bet wrong, Byron, what I'm referring to is that he bet that issue could defeat every other issue, and that was wrong. There were two. It was COVID, it was personality, it was many different things, but he bet that crime would trump everything. It doesn't trump everything, but it is a very salient issue for most people.
Well, I believe it trumps everything unless you're having a world historic pandemic. It really does.
Yep.
Usually trump everything. If it's a big issue, if there's a lot of crime, if people are legitimately, you can't talk a crime wave into existence when there's not one. You can't go out and say, oh, our murder rate's terrible when it's clearly lower than it has been. But if you have a dramatic increase in crime, then it becomes the most important issue wherever you are.
I've been told that Minneapolis is undergoing that. Not just Portland and Seattle, but other major cities. Have you heard that as well, Byron, that Minneapolis...
Yeah, this is the city, Minneapolis, that actually voted after the George Floyd death. After that, they voted to defund the police. The city council did, and they came out and they were proud about it. They completely lost their heads on the issue of public safety. And within months, they were asking for more money to hire more police because so many of them were retiring because they got the message and left.
Yeah, the thin blue line was thin indeed. Byron York, thank you. Stay tuned, America. Welcome back, America. To Hewitt, joined by Admiral James Stavridis, former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, former head of Southern Command, now chair of the Rockefeller Foundation. Good morning, Admiral. How are you?
Doing great, Hugh. How are you?
Great. I've got a different subject, one we've never discussed before, but you're in a great position to talk about. On Friday, the Army Times reported that Fort Hood and Fort Bliss, Texas, topped the list of Army installations where women are at the highest risk for sexual assault, taking into account several factors, according to a RAND Corporation study released Friday. Fort Riley, Kansas, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Fort Carson, Colorado round out the top 5. I bring this up because I got a email from a 2-star retired Marine Corps general who wrote to me, "This is stunning. The entire tone, even premise, is that this is a problem that cannot be effectively dealt with, as though the Army is a civilian society without leadership having literally absolute control over the entire environment. The Army is not a college campus. Beyond education of parties, there is iron-fisted discipline. Leadership is utterly failing our female soldiers. This is the Army. Rape is not a statistic. It's a behavior to be eradicated with aggressive leadership and discipline. This is horrible." He goes on to talk at length about this, and I am curious. He says the Army has it the worst of the 4 services, but he's a Marine. I know that sailors like you talk to Marines sometimes. What is the general situation in the military about this, and is this a problem that is recent or just recently recognized?
It is the latter. Recently recognized. If you could look back at our history, it's not good, and it's certainly not suddenly shifted. You can't point to a pivot and say, gosh, this is where the problem really began. When I was back in the 90s, Hugh, when I was captain of a destroyer, I had one of the very first destroyers that had a mixed gender crew. So I spent a lot of time diving into this, 20 years ago. And it's continued to be a significant problem. I wouldn't particularly point to the Army. You certainly see this across the services. And I think the general has it exactly right. It's a leadership problem, a challenge. We've got to confront it head on. And the way to do that is by constantly surfacing these cases, discussing them. And above all, it's listening to the soldiers when they come forward with their allegations, taking them seriously and having the chain of command dive into them. There's no magic here, and we have a problem, and we cannot continue to have this problem because, we'd say in the Navy, these are our shipmates. These are the women we work alongside, and of course, men are vulnerable to rape as well. We've got to get this fixed.
Now, is this one of those problems that if the leadership of a unit, a base, a ship raises it, it hurts the leader as much as it hurts the victim in terms of career going off? There are lots of reasons that victims don't step forward. I've dealt with that in civilian life and in the court system for a long time. People do not want to come forward for a variety of reasons. But are there reasons why commanders don't want to come forward? Does it hurt their careers to surface the issue?
I don't think it does. And I have never seen a case personally in my long years in the service where a commander was disciplined for bringing forward significant problems of this nature in his or her command. So I don't think that's the genesis of the problem. I think you put your finger on it, Hugh. It's a combination of young people who don't want to bring the problem forward when it occurs, when they're a victim, because they're unsure of how the treatment of the case will come out. And secondly, the military chain of command has fumbled these cases in many cases. Sometimes they've handled them well, but sometimes they fumbled them and badly. And I think that personally that the current push toward taking these kind of cases out of the traditional chain of command and putting them over on the side of the JAG Corps, our judicial branch, makes a lot of sense for exactly the reasons you described.
Now, when did that start? When did they start shifting to a separate pipe?
They haven't yet. At the moment, if a sexual case is brought forward, it is adjudicated like any other case, like theft or any other miscreant behavior, is adjudicated by the straight chain of command. On a ship, you go to sailor, to chief petty officer, to department head, to executive officer, to commanding officer, to commodore, et cetera. All the same in the services. What is under discussion for sexual abuse cases is if an allegation comes forward, instead of letting that chain of command investigate it, you have outside investigators come in, and they would come in from the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and then the case would go to a trial court convened outside the chain of command. It's a controversial idea, and the idea has been around for about a decade. It's been pushed hard by some on the Hill. It's taken me a while to come around to agreeing with it, but I am now at that point. I noticed that our current Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin, is wrestling with this decision right now, and by press reports, I haven't talked to Lloyd about it, by press reports, he is leaning in favor of moving it out of the chain of command.
And why would people resist that? There's got to be an argument on both sides with that, Admiral. Yeah. So what's the both sides argument for a civilian audience?
Yeah, it is that in the military, you want unity of chain of command because this is a group of men and women who have to go into combat. They have to be ready to respond at life and death situations, and therefore, for unit cohesion, you want the chain of command to be seen as the source of discipline and guidance. And when you introduce an outside look at a problem, it undermines confidence of junior sailors and soldiers in that chain of command. And I've wrestled with this. I think that the nature and scope of the problem of sexual assault is so pernicious, and we don't seem to be solving it using the traditional chain of command. I think we need to move to an outside look at it as again, I think this is where this is headed.
Now, last question, Admiral, because I want to ask you a question about Iran as well while we have limited time. There is, it seems to me, an easier command environment to control and punish, identify and punish that on a ship where you have a limited number of people and one command structure. On a base, I've always been confused when I go onto any military base, no matter what the service is, and how many different commands are operating and who's running what, and the base commander is different from the unit commander. It's just a myriad of structures, right? So lines of authority. But is it easier to deal with when you're on a ship than when you're at land on a base?
Yes, and for exactly the reasons you outlined. However, I will point out human beings are extremely creative when it comes to undertaking criminal activity, and that's the nature of what happens. And there are dark corners on ships and isolated spaces on ships, and that's where we see assaults occur. But yes, it's easier because you have more direct control over the situation on a warship.
And you have one commander who can set command tenor, right?
You do indeed. And again, when I commanded a mixed gender ship, I put a lot of personal emphasis on doing the right thing. The line I would use is, we're all shipmates here together. You know, you can date anybody you want, but please keep that outside our ship, outside the lifelines of the ship. It worked pretty well.
All right. Now, Admiral, in terms of the Iran JCPOA, they elected a real revanchist, a man accused of war crimes. And so Khamenei runs the country, so it doesn't really matter who's president. But the first thing he said is, we will not negotiate over our ballistic missiles. Ought we not to leave the table? I think we ought to. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think we ought to leave the table. He makes a statement like that, then we ought to leave the table. What do you think?
I think that in addition to saying he won't negotiate about ballistic missiles, he also said we won't negotiate about activities in the region, which is code for supporting Hezbollah and Houthis and all these other militant groups that are completely aligned with Iran. They're all terrorist organizations. I would say, Hugh, at a minimum, we ought to take a pause and say to the Iranians, we are deeply concerned about, A, the human rights record of this Ibrahim Raisi is his name, and he put the hard in hardliner. This is a guy who has killed repeatedly. He personally signed thousands of death warrants. He is as dark a figure as you can imagine. Oh, by the way, he is tipped to be the successor as the Grand Ayatollah when Ayatollah Khamenei goes on to the great mosque in the sky. So he's bad news. I think a pause is in order. And I remember President Biden vividly on the campaign trail saying we will lengthen and strengthen this agreement. And that is clearly Raisi putting a stake in the ground that no, you won't. And by the way, he also said very abruptly when asked if he would meet with the U.S. president, he said no. So I do not think any of that augurs well for the outcome of these negotiations.
But we're still there in Vienna, and I don't know who leads the team. I think it's Wendy Sherman. I'm not sure. She negotiated the JCPOA in large part, and John Kerry signed off on it. I think we ought to just pull up stakes and go. You say pause. Doesn't that mean the same thing? You just say, okay, we read the papers too.
I think the difference would be pull up stakes and go would be break off negotiations and signal that we're never coming back. I think that a pause would give the Iranians an opportunity to climb down a bit. And I would counsel the latter, but I suspect we will ultimately end up without a deal here.
No, that's good news for me to hear because, Admiral, I want to close on this. When they tell you what they think, you ought to believe them. That's my theory of everything. When people actually tell you Al-Qaeda back in the 90s were going to war with the United States, we should have listened to them. We ought to listen to Raisi. He's a killer. We ought to listen to him talk about killing.
And we ought to listen when Vladimir Putin says similar kinds of things and President Xi. And I agree with your proposition. People very seldom disguise the big intention. And so let's take counsel of that. And again, I think this is, I think my good friend Wendy Sherman, who I believe is leading that delegation, I think she's going to have her hands full here.
Admiral, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Admiral James Stavridis, United States Navy. You can find him all over the place. He's back on the road again with the Washington Speakers Bureau. You can find him at the Carlyle Group. You can find him at the Rockefeller Foundation. You find him here each week talking about issues like Iran and sexual harassment in the military. Don't go anywhere, America. I want you to stay right where you are. Brought to you by ReliefFactor.com. $19.95 gets you started on ReliefFactor.com. I talk about it 3 times in my daily show. At the bottom of the first hour when I take it, and then in hours 2 and 3 when I remind you to take it, depending on when your commute begins, because ReliefFactor.com works. It's the only supplement I've taken in 30 years of broadcasting. I've declined every other opportunity to take a supplement, and I'll tell you why. Because ReliefFactor.com actually works. I carry in Curcumin, Resveratrol, Omega. temporary relief for the relief of minor aches and pains, temporary support for the relief of minor aches and pains, and you can't do better than that 3-week starter pack, $19.95. Morning glory, America. Bonjour. Hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening this morning. Joined by United States Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Good morning, Senator. Great to talk to you.
Good morning, Hugh. Good to be on with you.
Thank you. Senator, I want to begin where I left off with Admiral Stavridis. The new president of Iran, as the Admiral said, put the H in hardliner. He's a killer. He signed thousands of death warrants. And he said, we're not going to give up our missile research. We are not going to stop supporting groups outside or change our regional activities. That means Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Why are we still in Vienna negotiating with them?
Well, Hugh, for Joe Biden and Barack Obama and the rest of the Democrats, it is always a good time to make a bad deal with Iran. You're right that the new president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, is a stone-cold killer. He executed thousands of political prisoners in the late 1980s. He's a hand-picked successor, not only for president, but most likely for the supreme leader position by the supreme leader. But the Democrats, led by Joe Biden, of course, view this as now critical to reenter the nuclear deal. You know, I remember in 2013, when Iran elected a so-called moderate, it was critical that we pursue a nuclear deal with them to empower the moderate. Now that they have elected the hardest of hardliners, it's critical that we pursue a nuclear deal so we can tie the hardliners' hands. There's never a bad time for these Democrats to pursue a bad deal with Iran. And Hugh, the reason is, and your listeners need to understand this, is that Joe Biden and his negotiating team, they're not getting fleeced. They're not being outwitted by the cagey Iranian negotiators in Vienna. They're getting exactly what they want. They think that if they can move Iran's nuclear program out of the center of the debate about U.S.-Iran policy, then they can pursue a kind of broader tacit alliance with Iran to balance off against our traditional allies, most notably Israel, but also the Arab nations in the Persian Gulf, who are no longer in favor with the young, liberal base of the Democratic Party. So that's ultimately what this is about. It's not about stopping Iran's nuclear program. It's not about getting a stronger and longer deal, as President Raisi has now said there's no chance of doing. It is about trying to quell the debate over Iran's nuclear program so they can enter into a kind of tacit alliance with Iran.
So one of the things that Admiral Stavridis said is that exactly what you said. This is the designated successor for the supreme leader. It is a theocracy. There's one leader in Iran. I had not read that. Has Raisi been tipped to by our intel agencies, or is that public knowledge, or is it just generally assumed by Iran experts that he's the guy? Because Khamenei is 82 years old and has been rumored to be in ill health for years.
So Hugh, most observers of Iranian politics believe that the supreme leader wanted to plan for a succession that would elevate someone that would continue to run the country in the same kind of theocratic, iron-fisted way that he did. The influence of the office of the presidency in Iran has waxed and waned over time. I think, though, that the supreme leader now, recognizing that his time with us may not be much longer, elevated Ibrahim Raisi, who, again, is a stone-cold killer who executed thousands of political prisoners and has been what you might charitably call a hanging judge in charge of the Office of the Prosecutor and Judiciary in Iran, is cut from the very same cloth.
Well, that's another argument just to get out of Vienna in a hurry. I don't think it's going to happen, but it ought to. Let me turn, if I can, to China, Senator Cotton. Your remarks with Laura Ingraham yesterday that Joe Biden doesn't have the stomach to make China pay for their behavior at the start of the pandemic caught a lot of attention. The fact is there are not going to be any sanctions, are there, on China? There's not going to be any kind of recourse other than maybe trial lawyers in the United States. Do you think that you might offer some sort of waiver of sovereign immunity for China so that damages can be sought here by the families of people dead as a result of their at least negligence?
Hugh, I proposed such legislation. Let's say the Democrats who are eager to do so for the victims of 9/11 are not so eager to do so for the victims of this plague that China unleashed on the world. There are many other things we could do, Hugh, to make China pay for their malevolence and their negligence and their deceitfulness. We could revoke their permanent most favored nation status. We could demand that international organizations like the World Bank start treating them like the developed economy they are and quit giving them sweetheart financing deals. Hugh, we could take away visas for every single member of the Chinese Communist Party and their family members, so their kids can't come take advantage of our best-in-the-world universities in a couple months. There are plenty of things we can do to impose real consequences on China, but I don't see that Joe Biden's administration has the stomach to do so.
Well, they will telegraph that very soon with their decision on the Olympics in Beijing in 2022. I was told by some people who are following it closely yesterday, if we issue a diplomatic boycott, we will be the only country in the world to do that. Do you agree with that, Senator Cotton?
I don't agree with that, Hugh. I do believe that we have to start a diplomatic boycott before any other country will join us. But I believe many other countries will want to take that step, countries that China has targeted over the last year for punitive action. But that should be the absolute minimum, a total diplomatic and economic boycott. No administration officials going to Beijing, no American CEOs who, frankly, should be pulling their sponsorships from the Beijing Winter Olympics to begin with. But, Hugh, there's also a more fundamental point. I want to see our athletes be able to compete. I want to see our athletes be able to beat Chinese athletes and bring home the gold. But the first thing we have to consider is the safety of American citizens. And those athletes and their coaches and their support staff could be exposed to electronic surveillance, to breaking and entering into their hotel rooms, to seizure of their DNA evidence under the guise of, say, performance-enhancing drug testing or COVID testing. They could even be subject to arbitrary arrest and detention, which China has been known to do to Western citizens. I'm not yet confident that the Biden administration has taken the steps necessary to ensure the safety and security of our athletes. And if they cannot do that, then we shouldn't send any Americans to the Beijing Olympics, to include our athletes and their coaches and support staff.
Great questions. Great questions to ask Secretary Blinken and the president. Let me turn to your chamber. The voting bill is not going to pass. It's not going to get 50 votes, much less filibuster-proof majority. And the filibuster isn't going anywhere. Why all this attention? Why all these column inches of wasted ink and paper and landing page space? It's not passing, and it shouldn't pass.
Well, no, it shouldn't pass. It's a massive power grab. The Democrats are frustrated that they did not win large majorities last year. They didn't even win a majority at all in the Senate. So rather than change their agenda to win more elections, they want to change the rules of our democracy. And some of them want to change the rules of the Senate as well. But this effort to federalize our elections is massively unpopular. Americans don't want, for instance, mandatory mail-out balloting and ballot harvesting. Americans love voter ID at the polls, as opposed to the Democrats who want to outlaw it. And Americans totally hate the idea that their tax dollars would subsidize attack ads for politicians they oppose. And that's what this bill would require. Now, the media is deeply, deeply behind this bill. They're deeply behind the effort to eliminate the filibuster and change the Senate rules forever as well. Senator Sinema, though, just published an op-ed once again saying she's not going to do it. And the media is going to keep asking the questions. At a certain point, it gets beyond reporting and it gets into advocating and promoting, which is what many of them have been doing for a while now.
No, we're way past that point. Let me close by asking you about the infrastructure bill. My friend Rob Portman, your colleague Rob Portman, says it's getting close, that about 60% of the bill is written. Do you agree with that assessment? 60% of the bill is agreed to. Do you agree with that, Senator?
So that's what Rob, pardon me, that's what Rob has told me. That's what others in the group have told me as well. I think that refers to the agreement in principle. Obviously, it'll take some time to reduce an agreement in principle to an actual bill. I'll have to review that at the time, as other senators will. I will say, though, that I commend them all for this effort. I think it's a very good thing for us to be trying to find common ground and consensus on areas where we can agree and advance the interests of our country without raising taxes, without borrowing a ton of money from China and charging it to our kids for the genuine and real infrastructure needs of our country.
But how do you do that and then get screwed on the reconciliation? Aren't you being very bad negotiators unless the Democrats agree to give up reconciliation?
Well, I think that's a big question, and a lot of Democrats are worried about that as well. You got Bernie Sanders out there demanding that before he votes for this bill, which he'll be able to read, that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and all these other Democrats agree to vote for his bill that's $6 trillion that isn't even written yet. That's not a very reasonable demand to you, and I don't think it's going to fly with a lot of his colleagues.
Well, I hope that would be the answer, which is we don't have to worry about reconciliation. That would be terrific. Senator Cotton, thank you so much. Have a great day. I appreciate your joining us. Don't go anywhere, America. Yesterday, my friend Robert O'Brien, former National Security Advisor, sat down with Larry Kudlow. I want you to hear what he had to say on many of the international issues driving the agenda today. Lots more ahead, including your phone calls at 1-800-520-1234. You're listening to The Hugh Hewitt Show.